My guest is Jeremy Kuzmarov, who holds a Ph.D. in American history from Brandeis University. He's managing editor of CovertAction magazine and is author of 5 books on U.S. foreign policy, including Obama's Unending Wars and The Russians Are Coming Again. Kuzmarov has also contributed to the prestigious Oxford History of Counterinsurgency and has written on specialized topics such as the war on drugs, U.S. airpower and its human cost, American military-based networks, and the false manipulations of the public in selling American wars. Jeremy, I'm so glad to have you. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure. You've written an article recently called "For 75 Years, NATO has been terrorizing the globe." Really?
Well, yeah, I think it has, a very pristine public image and presents itself as, a defender of Western civilization and the free world. But if you look into the history, it's not so pretty. Going back to the founding of NATO, I mean, they really, played up the Soviet threat. The Soviet Union had been decimated by the Nazi invasion, but they made it seem like, the Soviets were going to invade the United States anytime and were planning, major offensive into Europe, which was just not the case. But this kind of propaganda was necessary, to marshal support for NATO and a huge investment in the military. And then, there's a book by Daniel Ganser called NATO's Secret Armies. It looks at how NATO inserted itself into Western European countries and created these underground armies that were ready, in case of a communist takeover. But often they carried out terroristic activity as part of what he calls a strategy of tension, where they actually would carry out, terrorist acts like in Italy. They bombed the railway station and planted evidence to blame, left-wing parties to discredit them. And there were often fascist elements working with them. And then, they were involved, like in Korea, horrific wars during the Cold War. And then the post-Cold War, many said, oh, well, NATO's lost its purpose because it was founded as a defense alliance against the, exaggerated Soviet threat. But instead, NATO kept expanding. And I mean, that's a principal factor for the current conflict with Russia because, there had been an agreement that, the first Bush administration made an agreement with Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not be expanded and, toward the Russian borders. And from a Russian point of view, NATO is a very hostile military alliance. And figured like George Kennan, very conservative Cold Warriors, said this is, we don't want a new Cold War. I mean, the first Cold War was destructive enough. We have good hope for good relations. Now the Soviet Union has collapsed with Russia. Let's try and, have good relations and a peaceful new era. But instead, the Clinton administration expanded NATO in violation of this pledge. There was some agreement made with Gorbachev, but the Clinton administration violated that by expanding NATO into 3 Eastern European countries, and then Bush II expanded it further. And that, ultimately, the issue of NATO expansion into Ukraine is a key factor. That was a red line. Even William Burns, who now the CIA director, had said that's a red line for Russia. And yet they keep pushing NATO expansion. And Zelensky has said he wants to join NATO. And that's a big factor in the current terrible conflict in Ukraine that could threaten World War III. And, NATO was very much involved in the bombing of Kosovo, Serbia, in the 90s Balkan War. And that had a very terrible humanitarian consequence. And then they and led to the breakup of Yugoslavia. And, the U.S. got military bases out of that. And then NATO played a leading role in the attack on Libya, which totally destabilized the country, empowered jihadists there. And, Libya is now a failed state where it had been the most powerful economy in Africa under Gaddafi. I mean, he had his autocratic features, but we see these regime change operations often lead to just chaos and catastrophe for countries. And the NATO bombing is, killing many civilians. These are just examples of a pretty sordid history that the public should be more aware of.
Well, the idea that we're always sold is that we're just defending ourselves, and NATO is sold as a defensive organization. Is it defensive?
Well, yeah, I think that's really the mythology that has been cultivated since the beginning because they really had to play up the Soviet threat and they totally exaggerated that. I mean, again, the Soviet Union had been decimated after World War II, and the Russian people could not afford another war. They did not want to take on the West, and it was understood even by figures like Kennan that even the communist approach toward revolution was not to invade countries from outside, that it would come organically from within the population. That's what the Marxist Leninists hoped for. So the Soviet Union was never an aggressive country as far as carrying out. Yes, in its own area, it was trying to expand the Soviet empire, but it was never intent on conquering countries in Europe. And there have been studies of Stalin comparing Stalin and Hitler. And there's one book I read by Alan Bullock called "Hitler and Stalin: Parallel Lives," and it showed Stalin was not the same as Hitler, who engaged in reckless military aggression that caused World War II. Stalin was very in this biography emphasized Stalin's caution and pragmatism, particularly in foreign policy matters. So from the beginning, I think they had to play up this concept of the Soviet threat. And I think there's this denialism about Western imperialism that the United States is an heir, in our society. I mean, the United States is an heir to European empires, and the United States has kind of continued the colonial tradition. The U.S. has directly ruled over various territories at many points in history, and also practiced a form more indirect imperialism where they try and manipulate countries' governments to advance American interests and American economic control over the country. So NATO served that purpose of advancing American neocolonialism, and it's not really about defense, but it's packaged differently for the public.
The war in Ukraine has the Western media would lead you to believe that it was unprovoked. Is that true?
I don't think that's true because that ignores the backstory that this war really actually started in 2014 when there was a coup d'etat. From 2010 to 2014, Ukraine was run by Viktor Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian leader. And you can assess his rule differently. I mean, no leader is perfect, and there may have been legitimate grievances. But at the same time, he was spurning an IMF program to reorient their economy along purely neoliberal lines, and arguably some of his economic policy were very beneficial, particularly to the eastern Ukraine is more tied with Russia culturally and economically. But the Ukraine became a kind of battleground, a new great game. And post Cold War strategy was to try and pry Ukraine toward the Western orbit. And Ukraine is divided as a country. The western part of Ukraine is more oriented toward the West, eastern Ukraine more toward Russia, again culturally and economically. But the U.S. supported basically a color revolution or coup. Actually, Stratfor, the intelligence agency, referred to as a blatant coup in 2014 against Yanukovych to insert more pro-Western leaders. And they use all kinds of skullduggery, including black flag operation. This has been documented by even Ivan Kachanovsky, who's a professor at the University of Ottawa, who's writing a book on this and has done very detailed research how they use snipe. And this is what, going back to the book NATO's Secret Army, what they've done before, they use like provocateur and infiltrator. So they infiltrated Yanukovych's security service, and they carried out sniper attack to make it look like Yanukovych's forces were firing on their own people. But these were actually proxies of the West and Ukrainian opposition movement, which included fascist elements. And there was an American soldier as well as some Georgians who carried out some of the killings. And this was blamed on Yanukovych to make him look like this brutal dictator who was slaughtering his own people. And that helped build momentum for the regime change operation. He was driven out and fled to Russia. Then a lot of his supporters were hunted and killed, and that's what triggered the conflict in eastern Ukraine, which had been supporting Yanukovych. So the new government was installed by the United States, and they started again hunting down Yanukovych's supporters. So the Eastern Ukrainian didn't want to be, didn't acknowledge the legitimacy of this new government, and they voted for their own autonomy, not separation, but autonomy. And that's what triggered the war. The Ukrainian army then basically attacked the people of Eastern Ukraine, and the U.S. began under Obama, started providing massive weapons. At that point, it was called non-lethal aid, but it really was pure military aid. And the Ukraine army was attacking, carrying out shellings. And UN reports said that specified that a huge percentage of the shellings were carried out by the Ukrainian military, not the Russian. Gradually, the Russians were drawn in to defend the people of eastern Ukraine, who developed their own militias to try and fight back. And one of the big issues had been the language issue. The new Ukrainian government installed by the West was trying to push language laws and forcing kids in eastern Ukraine to study in Ukrainian language, not Russian, when they were ethnic Russians. So that was a major grievance. And you had the Minsk agreements was an attempt to settle the conflict and grant eastern Ukrainian their demands for autonomy, again, not separation. But Angela Merkel admitted that those agreements was a ruse, that the Western countries signed it just to build up time to build up Ukraine military forces. And it should be so. So the war really started in 2014, and Russian became gradually more drawn in. But there are huge atrocities that were barely, if ever, reported in Western media, carried out by the Ukrainian military with American arms, and a lot of Ukrainian young people didn't want to fight against their own, cousins in eastern Ukraine, and that's why they had to rely on these militias like Azov Battalion, and there were fascist neo-Nazi elements who dominated those battalions. And this Burisma may have been a front to funnel money into Azov Battalion, other militias. So it was a very dirty war. These militias carried out major war crimes and systematic torture. And this was never reported in Western media. So the public had the impression that Putin just woke up one day and decided to invade Ukraine. But this war had been going on for 8 or 9 years already. And the people of eastern Ukraine were begging for Russian intervention to save them from this brutal attack. And many had been living in underground. They had to flee their homes. There was about 12 or 13,000 eastern Ukrainians killed and over 100,000 displaced. And many had to live underground for years. Kids couldn't go to school. They had to live in underground shelters because of constant bombing by the Ukraine. So this story was never told, and it looked like Russia just decided to invade one day. But they clearly had been provoked. I mean, it was reported in the New York Times. It came out very recently that the CIA had set up about 12 or 13 bases in Ukraine. Once this coup took place, and you had the government of Poroshenko and then Zelensky, who are reorienting Ukraine to the West, and they allowed for 12 or 13 major CIA bases, and it looked like Ukraine was being used as a base to attack Russia, to carry out a full-fledged attack on Russia by the West. And that, seems to be going on now. That the U.S. has been giving long-range weapons, and they're taking the war into Russia itself. So Russia had a legitimate security threat on its border. You can judge Russian action anyway, but many countries would behave in the same way that Russia has done. If Mexico is used as a base for a foreign power to launch attacks or to plan a potential invasion of the United States, and the foreign power was supporting a government that was assaulting people in a particular province that were more oriented to the United States, the U.S. would respond absolutely as well. So, that story really has not been properly told. And many people are not very well informed up to this day about how that conflict started, and they simply blame Russia when it's much more complicated. And the Western role and U.S. role is very significant.
So this war has been described as democracy versus autocracy, with the U.S. being on the side of democracy. But what I've heard, and you can confirm it or not, that the Kiev government has oppressed the Russians in the east and the south in 3 or 4 major ways that are contrary to democracy. One is language, outlawing the Russian language, outlawing opposition political parties, outlawing dissenting media outlets, and then making war on the people. Is there any truth in that? Am I getting that right or wrong, or what?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And to add to that, I mean, it's a complete myth that this is a war of democracy versus autocracy. Ukraine is not a democracy in any way. The Zelensky government banned 12, once the Russian special military operation commenced, the Zelensky government banned 11 or 12 opposition parties, including the left-wing party like the Communist Party and the Socialist Party. And not only were they banned, they were banned, so many of the members of those parties, including members of parliament, had to flee. And any party that advocated for peace or better relations with Russia was banned. And so members of those parties, including members of parliament, many had to flee the country. Others have been jailed. Um, and some of them have been hunted down and murdered in a kind of Phoenix style operation. If you remember the Operation Phoenix from Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
the CIA was training local proxy forces in South Vietnam to hunt down anyone associated with the Viet Cong, including the Viet Cong had established shadow governments in parts of South Vietnam, and some were running towns and cities, and they would hunt down and assassinate town mayors. And this kind of thing has actually happened in Ukraine, where they're hunting them down. It's been reported. There have been scattered reports, like in mainstream media, like the New York Times, about the CIA's training these commando units who are hunting down opposition elements and members of these banned parties, even in Russia. And for instance, they discussed how they set car bombs and killed like a town mayor who was pro-Russian, in eastern Ukraine. The people are ethnic Russians, and they're very close ties with Russia. So it's natural that they have very close relation with the Russians and are against the Ukrainian government policy, and they're being murdered. And Ilya Kiva was the head of the Socialist Party in Ukraine's parliament, who had to flee to Russia, and then he was hunted down and murdered mafia style. And this was reported in BBC. Um, he was killed. He went for a walk in a park in Moscow, and he was assassinated. And the killers were bragging about this. So this is really sick. I mean, they present this as a democracy when they're killing opposition leaders. And I mean, Russia has autocratic features too, but the Communist Party is legal, is the main opposition party in Russia. I mean, they have been cracking down on anti-war dissenters in Russia since it began. So neither country is in any way a model democracy, but Ukraine is, I think, the level of repression is far worse in Ukraine because Navalny was an opposition figure in Russia, but there's no evidence. Even the intelligence agencies have said that there's no evidence. Putin ordered his death, and we don't have to go into that case, but there is evidence that Navalny did violate the law. And he was not necessarily a political prisoner. He was involved in schemes with his brother, corruption schemes and embezzlement that landed them in jail. And then he violated his order as far as leaving the country. Now, the sentence was, I think, draconian that he got. But there is grounds to argue that he was not a political prisoner. And there's also no evidence that Putin ordered his death. Even the intelligence agencies have corroborated this. Whereas Ukraine, we have direct evidence they're bragging about assassinating opposition figures, and they banned the Communist and Socialist Party where the Communist Party is legal in Russia. So, my assessment is that the autocracy is far worse in Ukraine than Russia.
I have heard, and I don't have any way of knowing or confirming it, but I've heard that Ukraine is a very corrupt country. And for example, when we send $1 billion in aid, insofar as that money actually goes to Ukraine and not just to U.S. military interests, like at one point there was a report that maybe only 30% of the weapons sent got to the battlefield, and the rest were sold on, worldwide black markets. Is there any truth in that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you're absolutely right. It's an incredibly corrupt country. You have figures like, billionaire. It was really an oligarchy. There was a small network of billionaire that dominated the political system, and kind of like what's evolving in the United States, just bought off the politicians. And you had this figure like Ihor Kolomoisky, with this warlord. He was appointed the governor, one of the eastern provinces, by Zelensky, so he could funnel weapons into Azov and other militias. But yeah, he was this corrupt figure. Now he's been indicted in U.S. Court. He can't step foot on American soil because he's under indictment here for embezzlement scheme. With all the money he had, he was running corrupt schemes here in the United States and through American banks. So that's just one example of a corrupt figure, who has a huge political influence there. And yeah, it's a situation kind of like Afghanistan, where it's just a complete waste of American taxpayer dollar, because as you point out with those statistics, a lot of these weapons are not even are just being stolen, sold off on the black market and stolen. And if you follow the papers carefully, you'll see that periodically, Zelensky has purged various government officials. There are some public corruption scandals that have come to light, and that's probably just the tip of the iceberg, because that's just what's being revealed publicly. So yeah, I mean, Americans, aside from just the immorality and all the death, just on a practical level, Americans have to ask, why my taxpayer dollar? I mean, it's a complete waste of my hard-earned taxpayer dollar, because those weapons are being stolen by corrupt elements, and this war is just going to go on endlessly, like Afghanistan. And what are we getting out of this? Absolutely nothing. When we have serious problems here in the United States, the government of the United States is supposed to look after its own people and fund things like education and infrastructure and healthcare, and instead it's just brokering a weapons pipeline to some of the most corrupt governments in the world. It's fueling violence. So
Let's talk about efforts to make peace. You mentioned the Minsk Accords, and then there was an attempted peace agreement in in April of 2022, about 6 weeks after the war started. So what have been the attempts to make peace before the Russian so-called invasion and after that?
Well, yeah, there were two Minsk agreements that was signed by many different countries, including the Russians, and offered a hope that, I mean, it wasn't a perfect agreement, but it was a temporary solution that would have avoided the catastrophe that we're seeing now, and it included a lot of the demand of the Eastern Ukrainian that they didn't demand to separate from Ukraine. They still wanted to be part of Ukraine, but they wanted more autonomy. They wanted more ability for self-government, and they wanted an abrogation of these language laws and the right to choose their own language in schools. And that was a part of the Minsk Agreement. And yeah, I think it called for, Russian troops could not enter eastern Ukraine, and there are all kinds of provisions. I don't remember every one off the top of my head, but it was a very reasonable agreement, and there were two Minsk agreements. And unfortunately, yeah, Angela Merkel came out and said directly that the Western countries who signed it or involved didn't take it seriously, and that was just to buy time to build up Ukraine military so they could take on the Russians. And it seemed that they've ignored history, because we know how countries who take on the Russians has fared, from the Mongols to Napoleon uh, to the Nazis. They always lose. I mean, the Russians are very proud, patriotic people, and they're able to mobilize to defend their country. History shows that, just like the Afghans. So this is a fool's crusade. I mean, Ukraine is this tiny country, and they coexisted with Russia for centuries. And I think they're just being stirred up by outsiders, and it's causing their own self destruction. I mean, they've lost an entire generation of their youth, have been killed, and now a lot of youth fled the country. And how's that also going to affect their economy in the future when they've lost so many young people? Uh,
Let's talk about that just a minute. One thing I wanted to mention, it has been in some circles flying the Ukraine flag, in your social media profile, even the U.S. Congress, they were waving Ukrainian flags on the floor of the United States Congress. And it seems to me like it's giving a 5-year-old a gun and telling them to point it at a cop. For pouring weapons into the country does not mean you're supportive of the Ukraine people and what has been the result of that, but something on the order of 500,000 dead Ukrainians, countless millions had to flee, etc.
Yeah, this is causing the destruction of Ukraine as a country, and creating hell on earth for its people. I mean, they're just being sent, young men being sent into a meat grinder on the Eastern Front, and the Russians know how to fight. And it's reminiscent of World War One, where you have these trench warfare, where just people are being slaughtered on both sides, and it's sad to see young people in the prime of their life being killed. And then, what about the future of the country when you have all your youth? I mean, many had to flee. There are reports we're getting, even in our media, that they've had to raise the draft age into the mid-40s, and that they're also kidnapping people in the streets of Kiev to enlist them in the army. Uh, and then, yeah, again, you have to think in the long term, if they've lost their workforce, how their economy going to function. And Zelensky sold off a lot of the Ukrainian assets. One other part of the injustice is that they're basically dismantling their own economy. He's privatized a lot of industry and allowed Western capitalists to come in and take over. Like, he sold off land, and Monsanto has come in and grabbed a lot of the land. A lot of the economy being sold off to private interests, like backed by Wall Street firm like BlackRock. And then, the Biden administration appointed Penny Pritzker to head this economic reconstruction agency for Ukraine. And Pritzker, the former commerce secretary, who's tied with the Pritzker banking dynasty, and was involved in all kinds of white collar crime. And she's just going to turn it over to Wall Street, allow Wall Street, a firm like BlackRock, to basically come to own Ukraine's economy. So they're basically losing their sovereignty as a nation. And he's also promoted Zelensky a lot of regressive labor laws. So the workers are going to be increasingly, poorly treated and paid. So you're going to and you have already rising inequality. So this doesn't benefit Ukraine at all. I fully agree with you. You can wave the flag, but you're actually, Ukraine is being turned into a neo-colony of the United States. And that's really only in the interests of Wall Street and some wealthy interests in the United States. So I think there, as usual, the public is being manipulated into thinking this is a great moral cause, when it's the exact opposite. It's a sowing the destruction of the Ukrainian population.
Something that seems to me to be historically unprecedented is the complete lack of contact or diplomatic dialogue between the leaders of the two countries. Biden has had no contact with Putin in the 2.5 years the war has been going on. In contrast, Eisenhower had dialogue with Khrushchev, and so did Kennedy. Nixon had dialogue with Brezhnev. Reagan had dialogue with Gorbachev. And now we're in a time that's every bit as dangerous. But the Biden administration, Anthony Blinken, all of them seem intent on not talking at all with Putin.
Yeah, I fully agree. That's very disturbing. And I found it very disturbing when Donald Trump went to meet with Putin, that he was just
Yeah.
ridiculed and attacked. And you still see him, oh, he's Putin's best friend and Putin BFF, and they make a joke about it. I mean, look, he was doing what, as you point out, leaders in the United States do, and that offered hope for some kind of mediation. And I don't think actually Trump adopted in the end a pretty hostile policy toward Russia. He pulled out of some arms control agreements like the INF Treaty. He ratcheted up aid. Before the special military operation, he signed off on anti-javelin missiles that Biden had been pushing, but Obama hadn't sold that. So he was upping the ante, and he was pretty anti-Russia. He was expanding sanctions, sanctions from hell on Russia. And this is before the special military operation. So he was pretty hostile to Russia, and yet they call him Putin BFF because he went and met with Putin once in Moscow. So that was very disturbing. And yeah, you didn't have Kennedy or Eisenhower attacked for meeting. And I mean, look, it yielded fruit, and those meetings led to the arms control arrangements. Like, it was Kennedy's meeting, and Kennedy was starting to push for a thaw in relation. Then he was assassinated, and then Nixon kind of picked that up, and it led to some of these arms control treaties, like the INF treaty was signed in the 80s, but before that you had the SALT treaty, SALT 1 and SALT 2. So these were important
Strategic arms limitation talks.
Yeah. So that started under Nixon. I
And
think was signed. So that
Kennedy,
the diplomacy led to these
yeah.
arms control agreements, which was good for everybody and kind of ratcheted down the tension and the threat of nuclear war. But Trump pulled out of the INF treaty. SALT, I don't think, will be renewed. And then there's a couple others, and yeah, they're not even talking. So, and now the U.S. is giving Ukraine weapons to strike into Russia. So now the threat of World War III is greater than it's ever been.
Right. I was going to say that, like Kennedy, this was like, I was born shortly before he died. And in June of 1963, Kennedy gave a talk at American University where he is pushing for a nuclear test ban treaty. And that's an example of, pushing for rational limitations on nuclear weapons. Whereas, let's talk a little bit about there could have been a peace agreement in April of 2022. It was brokered partly by Turkey. The former prime minister of Israel had said that the peace agreement was pretty well worked out, and then who was it? The former prime minister of Great Britain flew in and said, "This is off. We don't have your back if you're going to make peace with Russia," that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm butchering it, but you could fill us in on the details of that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I read about that too. Yeah, Boris Johnson went in there to basically scuttle the agreement. And yes, I mean, it goes to show there could have been peace a long time ago, and how many people have died since. And it's kind of reminiscent. If you study the Vietnam War, they had peace talks, in the going around the '68 election, that Nixon sabotaged because he wanted to win the election, and it would have been bad for his reelection hopes if there were peace breaking out. And then Henry Kissinger got the Peace Prize for the same deal 5 years later, after Nixon had bombed the hell out of North Vietnam as well as South Vietnam, and thousands of Americans and probably a million Vietnamese died in those 5 years. So it goes to show, the leaders are often not committed at all to peace. They want the war to go on. Some of it may be the weapon makers are making a lot of money off this war, so they wanted to just continue. And I think the plan was to bog. I think the strategy of the United States, actually, it's outlined in a RAND report from 2019 that people could look up, called Unbalancing Russia. The plan really was like the plan of the 80s, because in the 80s, Brzezinski, who was the National Security Council advisor under Jimmy Carter, said we want to draw the Russian into the Afghan trap and kind of bleed them over a decade and undermine the Soviet Empire. And I think that's a strategy in Ukraine: draw the Russian into a quagmire, and that's going to, damage their economy. They're going to, the war will take a toll economically, and then to ratchet up these sanctions. And the information war is very important, to present Russia in a demonized way, to vilify them, to justify sanctions against them, and that these sanctions would cripple the Russian economy and fuel civil unrest. And then the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, was supporting Navalny and opposition elements. So I think they want the war to continue. They think it'll damage the Russian economy, and that the sanctions will fuel civil unrest. Although at this point, that strategy is not working, because Putin was able to circumvent the sanctions by strengthening his trading relations with China, as well as finding other outlets to sell Russian oil, and also developing more autonomy and national control over the Russian economy. So the Russian economy is actually experiencing slow growth, and the civil unrest hasn't yet developed in the way the West thought. But I think they're going to persist with this strategy. And they don't like Putin because he's more of a nationalistic leader. In the 90s, you had Boris Yeltsin in leading Russia, and he was just kind of a weak leader who allowed Western corporations to come in and start to gain control over Russian natural resources, because Russia is one of the richest countries as far as natural resources, including oil and all kinds of minerals, and the West and U.S. Covets that.
Well, how has this multifaceted war against Russia been going? If you look at, there's been a so-called rapprochement between Russia and China. China brokers something of more of an understanding between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Saudi Arabia is among the countries that want to join BRICS. It seems like the rest of the world is uniting against a common enemy. And I'd be happy if there weren't any empires, and I'd be happy if the United States were not an empire. But if you value empire, you're making all the wrong moves right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think Americans should come to the understanding that we don't need to be an empire to be a prosperous country and have a good living standard here. America has tremendous riches. It's always been has a great innovative workforce, has good education system, especially as far as science and technological innovation. So we have all the tools for a successful economy without needing to be an empire. And I think it's a narrow elite that's taken us on that path, their own greed and arrogance. So Americans could look at the world situation today and say we need to change our course. And I think they're all kind of blowback from that empire, including the epidemic of mass shooting. It creates this kind of dark force really in our society, and this over militarization has blown back. I mean, our police are overly militarized, and they almost kind of wage war. They declare war on drug, they start to wage war on domestic population like African Americans who are targeted under the drug war. So I think our nation needs a different course. And we see we are losing the great game, because a lot of these, as you point out, policies are backfiring, and leaders around the world are getting smart and starting to unify against the empire. And we see that with the growth of the BRICS and the move towards an alternative economic order that would be more just and do away with neo-colonial arrangements. And this Russia-China alliance, I mean, that was the nightmare of grand strategists like Kissinger and
Mhm.
Brzezinski during the
Mhm.
Cold War did everything to create a divide, and they
Right.
pushed the Sino-Soviet split, and they tried to drive a wedge between Russia and China, but they're not able to do that now because the U.S., I think, has really pushed the Russian with these sanctions. It forced the Russians into alliance with China, and the U.S. is at the same time, encircling China militarily and threatening China. So China needs Russia. The two need each other, and together they form a formidable powerhouse. And China is a much more advanced economy than it was, in the Cold War years. And through the Belt and Road Initiative, they're drawing a lot of developing world countries into their orbit because they're providing concrete benefits to those countries with
Yeah.
massive infrastructure projects. And the U.S. can't match that. The World Bank and IMF have often decimated third world economy because they push this neoliberal austerity agenda that didn't empower the poor and that fueled inequality.
Well, what do you mean by austerity? Because that is a big reality that is not in very many people's vocabulary.
Oh, by austerity, I mean like they pushed, in the IMF and World Bank provide loans to third world countries. They forced the government to adopt like a structural adjustment where they cut public services, with the idea that they have to lower taxes, cut their debt, and not create inflation. But by cutting public services, yeah, they're taking money away from education program or healthcare. So it's a conservative approach of limited government spending, but that prevents the government from enacting like infrastructure projects or funding for education or healthcare that would help the poor in those countries. So China's stepping in with more money for infrastructure projects, and when they're giving loans, they're not attaching the same condition that the government has to adopt a more conservative policy and cut public sector spending. And I mean, generally, the Chinese approach to government of the Chinese Communist Party is a stronger state sector, where the conservative American philosophy would emphasize private enterprise and low tax and limited government. But the Chinese approach is winning now more hearts and minds because, yeah, again, they're not forcing government to cut back on social spending, which can benefit the population significantly.
I'm wanting to explore the idea of neutrality. It seems like the Ukrainian government, let me know if I get these names wrong, Yanukovych and Poroshenko. Yanukovych, the leaders before Zelensky committed the sin of wanting to be neutral. And I think I recall that, back to the Lyndon B. Johnson administration or prior to that, neutrality or neutralism was a sin. And this is reminiscent of like Suharto, the non-aligned movement. You can't be, the term third world originated as, there's the US and there's the Soviet Union, and there's this third world, and we want to be neutral. But, George W. Bush said, you're either with us or against us. You're not allowed to be neutral.
Yeah, and that's caused a lot of catastrophes. I mean, many countries, it's in their best interest to be neutral, to try and avoid conflict and focus on their internal development. But yeah, in the Cold War, I think you're right. You give some good examples. Like Indonesia was a classic case in the Cold War, where because Sukarno was the first president of Indonesia after they gained their independence from the Dutch, and he was promoting the non-aligned movement, and he hosted the first non-aligned movement summit in Bandung, Indonesia, in the 1950s. And the non-aligned movement was, yeah, third world countries who didn't want to become a neo-colony of the United States and didn't want to become a satellite of the Soviet Union. They wanted to focus on their own internal development, and they felt that they should form a coalition and try and help each other to maintain their neutrality. But, the Dulles brother in the 50s, the Eisenhower administration came out and said, basically they presented those governments as being too close to the communist side. And, in the Indonesian case, they didn't want to antagonize the Soviets, so they legalized the local Communist Party, which was characteristic of many of those governments. And so because of that, they were a target of U.S. subversion, regime change, and CIA covert operations. In the case of Indonesia, yes, Sukarno was ultimately overthrown in a coup backed by the Johnson administration and CIA that brought in Muhammad Suharto, who then liquidated the Indonesian Communist Party, and they killed at least 1 million people, a bloodbath, and many ethnic Chinese who were supporting the communists or maybe sympathetic to a left-wing ideology were targeting these pogroms. And that was the fate of a lot of neutralist leaders in the Cold War, like the Cambodian leaders. Prince Sihanouk tried to maintain neutrality, but the U.S. Needed Cambodia for bases for the Vietnam War, so he was overthrown in the 1970 coup. And there are other examples, including in South America, where left-leaning leaders who wanted neutrality were overthrown. And yeah, we may see a repeat with the new Cold War. We may see a repeat of that history. And I agree, yeah, Yanukovych was more pro-Russian, yeah, but basically he was trying to steer an independent course for Ukraine, and he was a target of regime change. So, yeah, the U.S. Has often been involved in overthrowing leaders who are very reasonable and leaders who are, widely respected among their own people as authentic nationalist leaders. And those are the leaders that are overthrown, and the country, become much worse, worse off when they're removed.
So let me ask you about the Middle East, especially like how would you characterize the difference between the prevailing view of the Middle East and the reality, especially as it relates to Gaza?
Well, I think there's been a lot of prejudice toward Muslims. I mean, you can go back in history. There's a recent book about the massacre of Muslims in the Philippines around the turn of the 20th century during the Spanish-American Philippine War, the Moro. And even in that time, they were kind of presented as, backward people who mistreated their women, and this kind of justified going in. And because the Moro, when the U.S. colonized the Philippines, the Moro population, the Muslim population, didn't accept U.S. colonial rule, and they were presented very pejoratively. And this set the groundwork for the massacre by the U.S. Army of the Moro. So that actually, this book kind of argued that this was a prelude to America's conduct in the Middle East. That the Muslim, I mean, I think it's not politically correct anymore, to be outwardly racist toward African Americans. But I think some of the rhetoric you hear about Muslims and people living in the Middle East is blatantly racist. And if people said that about African American, they would be
Mhm.
accosted. So I think there's a general prejudice, and that justified. The U.S. Has a long pattern of wanting to dominate the Middle East and control the oil wealth there. And I think they become more aggressive, especially with the rise of the neoconservatives starting in the 70s and 80. Became ever more aggressive in trying to, and the Carter administration with the Carter Doctrine established a U.S. military base network in the Middle East that's subsequently expanded. And the War on Terror, which was first declared by Reagan, was basically a pretext to expand the U.S. military base network in the Middle East. And I think there's something like 40,000 U.S. troops. Israel functioned largely as a proxy of the United States. The U.S. has bases in the Negev, in Israel, and the U.S. military and intelligence agencies collaborate very closely with the Israeli Defense Forces and Mossad. So basically, they're working together to expand, each of their power. And I think the Israeli government is dominated by right-wing hardliners whose vision is that of a greater Israel. And I think the U.S. supports the project. And in fact, yeah, I think you mentioned Eisenhower. And I was pointing this out yesterday. The last time the U.S. had a balanced approach toward the Arab-Israeli conflict was in the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower actually threatened sanctions on Israel when Israel, Britain, and France were going to invade Egypt in 1956, when Nasser, who was a nationalistic leader, somewhat like a Putin, he took measures to nationalize the Suez Canal, which had been owned by a private company. Israel, Britain, and France were going to invade,
Mhm.
but Eisenhower threatened sanctions and other stern measures, and they pulled back. So it showed the U.S. could exert their leverage to rein in the hardliners in Israel. Um, but from Kennedy onward, the U.S. basically just began supplying copious weaponry to Israel, and basically, I think. Because there were some elements in the Eisenhower administration, that era, who worried that if the U.S. supported Israel and antagonized the Arabs, it could threaten U.S. Interest in the Middle East and ability to access oil, because there would be a huge backlash against the United States. But that viewpoint lost out in the in the upper reaches of power, and they decided to just support Israel to the hilt as a kind of proxy. And Israel humiliated that. Nasser was a foil of the U.S. interest in the Middle East, because he was a socialist. He was like Sukarno. He was pushing for Egypt's role, membership in the non-aligned movement. He was a socialist who wanted to nationalize the oil and Suez Canal and assert Egyptian control over its resources and forge unity with other Arab countries under more of a socialist economic model. So the CIA tried to overthrow him but failed. But then they began really arming the Israelis, who in Six-Day War in 1967 struck at Nasser and humiliated and defeated his armies in 6 days. And he died several years later, broken man. So Israel did a great service for America, and from there, that relationship built. Just like it's like that was a formative phase in that relationship, and they've grown ever closer. But we see the destructive consequences today. Is that Israel is so armed with the latest military technologies, and they're capable of meting out brutal destruction. And their goal seems to be to drive the Palestinians out of the occupied territories and to expand the greater Israel. And the U.S., I think, supports that project because they feel it could benefit the U.S. ability to control and dominate the Middle East. But it's threatening a major Middle East war at this point.
Let's talk about the role of Iran in that potential wider Middle East war, because it seems to me that Iran has always been defensive and has been, if anything, pushing back against our aggression. I mean, go back to Mohammad Mossadegh and the first democratically elected prime minister of Iran, and he was overthrown in a coup that involved the United States and Britain. And then you have the Shah of Iran, 25 years, brutal dictator, pro-US, brutal dictator. And then after that, you might not agree with the government of Iran or the religious aspect of it, but I mean, one might take issue with that, but it seems to me like they're not a threat. And then, so that's an idea there. But then there's also, Iran seems to be the adult in the room right now. I mean, anyway, just take that wherever you want.
Okay, well, yeah, I agree with your assessment. I mean, they had a revolution in 1979 where they asserted their sovereignty as a nation. So, yes, we may not necessarily agree with the policy decisions or ideology of their government, but it's their government, their country. And I mean, there had been a battle between more leftist elements of the revolution, but it should be noted the Shah, with the assistance of the CIA, because the CIA created SAVAK, the Iranian intelligence agency under the Shah, and the focus was on purging and destroying the Tudeh, which was a left-wing pro-Moscow party in Iran. and that party was decimated, and there was significant repression. Their leaders had to flee into exile or were sent to the Evin prison where they were tortured, and now that's a museum, and many were killed. So the left-wing movement in Iran was just devastated. So the main opposition came from the Islamist forces, and when the Iranian Revolution broke out, there was some factional, from my understanding, factionalism between the Islamists, and there were still remnants of the Tudeh, but the Islamist elements won out. But yeah, I mean, this was a nationalist revolution, and Iran has been a sovereign country, but they've been the neoconservatives have sought since the Iranian Revolution to overthrow the Iranian government and reestablish the reign of the Shah. I think there was even talk of bringing back the Shah's heirs to run Iran following a regime change operation. I've seen some articles where they've interviewed, I guess it's the son or grandson of the original Shah. So that's what the neocons want. But Iranians, I mean, they'll fight for their sovereignty, just like Americans fought the British. And whether Iranians are thrilled with every policy of their government, just like here, we may not like a lot of the policies, even domestic area, they argue about it. But American would ultimately fight if their country, if we were under attack from a foreign power, American would mobilize and fight to defend the country. And that's the same with Iran. So this is a fool's errand, just like what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, that they're threatening a war with Iran. And, I heard an interview on Fox News a few months ago with Oliver North. They brought him out, the famous Iran-Contra felon. And I forget, he was talking with the host, and they're talking about how it'd be great to liberate Iran. And, they were talking like this is going to be easy and something they could easily achieve. And it's like they learned nothing from Iraq. I mean, Iraq was just, they created absolute chaos and catastrophe, and they couldn't have their way there. And Iran would be even worse. I mean, the people are even more, committed to defending the country and their revolution, and their sovereignty. And I think there's more cohesion in Iran because they don't have the same Sunni Shia. From my understanding, I think Iraq was very divided between Sunni and Shia, and the U.S. was trying to exploit that, whereas Iran is more of a Shia country. So you don't have those divisions a foreign power could exploit. So this is a pure fool's errand, but it seemed they're doing everything to provoke the Iranians, including what Israel did by assassinating the Hamas leader on Iranian soil. And before that, they had bombed the Iranian embassy in Syria. So these are major provocative moves. And you can imagine if that was done to the United States, we'd already be at war. But I agree with your point. So far, Iran has displayed remarkable restraint because I think they know that they don't want to invite a war. They don't want to be bombed. So they're trying to prevent a war. And I hope this war doesn't go forward.
Right. So, Jeremy Kuzmarov, one last question, and that is, how did we Americans get to where we are so uninformed about what our country is doing? I mean, do you agree with that or not? That's where I'm coming from. People are so uninformed to our detriment. How did that happen, and what's the solution to it?
That's a very good question. I would say that the reasons have to do with the oligarchic nature of our government. That I think the government been taken over really by a narrow elite, very wealthy elite, and they control the media, and so the media really dumbs things down. It boils it always down to a very simplistic term. It doesn't give proper historical context, like what we were discussing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It just kind of adopts these demonologies and a kind of Hollywood type cartoon analysis almost. And that's, I think, by design, that it deliberately dumbed down. And anytime there's an attempt to raise the intellectual level or present more critical analysis, people are fired or they're intimidated. And I think you have the same thing in the education system, because I taught in universities and I had a lot of problems teaching the kind of stuff we're discussing today, or the history of the CIA, or some of the sordid aspects of NATO and a critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, the students were very eager to learn about it, but I faced a problem, and you have to look at how those universities are run and how they get donations from the wealthy people, and how those wealthy people insert themselves, or they're kind of proxy in the board of trustees. Um, and it affects the way the university is run. So I think you have that in education, and I think there's a lot of intimidation that goes on in schools. So the curriculum gets either dumbed down, and I also had that issue with dumbing down the curriculum, because I was criticized for like assigning too many books. And these are bright students, and as a teacher, I want to challenge my students. I mean, when I was a student and I went to school in Canada, McGill University, a very high standard, and like I remember my freshman course, I took a U.S. history course, and like the teacher assigned 10 or 11 books, and it was a lot, but I had to really spend my time in the library. I would have, and I remember the teacher said, you know you can still have a good social life, but go out on the weekend, but during the week you study and work hard. And I followed that. I mean, I worked hard, and I was I learned strategies for reading quickly or maybe skimming some chapters. But and then I found, in a lot of schools I worked at, they deliberately dumbed it down, or that they didn't want to even challenge the student in the way I was challenged. Yeah, again, I think it has to do with the structure of management, and again, the rule of a narrow, very wealthy elite is able to control the media and educational institutions, and kind of dumb things down and prevent social criticism. And so you don't have necessarily overt censorship or repression like in a totalitarian country, but you have these kind of subtle ways that academics, for instance, who promote critical thinking are not going to advance in their career. They may be denied tenure, and so people get intimidated. The same in the journalism field. So I think that's how it works. And American are very, and universities are very good as far as the sciences, technology. But when it comes to the humanities, and particularly civic and political affairs, that's where the shortcomings exist. And I think that's true of the media as well. You can get good reporting on technology or the business world, but when it comes to reporting on politics, it's very heavily controlled and dumbed down.
Tell us about Covert Action magazine.
Well, Covert Action magazine was founded in the 1970s by Philip Agee, who was a CIA whistleblower. And he was irate. Like, he had started as like a true believer in the Cold War, and he was sent into South America. He graduated from Notre Dame University. He came from a conservative family, but when he was working in South America in various countries, including Ecuador and Uruguay, he saw that the United States was kind of on the wrong side of history. They were supporting these corrupt, conservative elements, and trying to stamp out social movement that were trying to fight for the poor and more just society. And he was doing all kinds of dirty work. And like a turning point for him was when he was meeting with a Uruguayan police officer, and the guy was being tortured in the next room, and he realized he had given the information that led to that guy's arrest and torture. So,
Hmm.
so he quit the CIA. He wrote a expose called Inside the Company, and he founded the magazine Covert Action magazine, which used to be called Covert Action Information Bulletin, to expose what the CIA was doing, to alert the American public, because he felt it was that they had betrayed the American public, that the CIA was carrying out illegal activity in violation of U.S. and international law. So the magazine, it was existed as a print magazine for many years, and it was restarted as a webzine by Philip Agee's son, Chris Agee, and it aims to present critical analysis of U.S. foreign policy and where possible expose covert operations or machinations.
And are you the editor?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, Jeremy Kuzmarov, thank you so much for joining me. I urge our audience to check out your work at jeremykuzmarov.com, check out Covert Action Magazine, and also check out Jeremy's Substack, which is at Kuzmarov, right? Substack.com/@Kuzmarov, Kuzmarov. Am I right about that?
Yes.
Thanks so much for joining me. We'll have to do it again soon.
My pleasure. Great discussion.